Thank you so much for coming. I'm Gabriel Cuellar, the organizer of this series. I have the great pleasure to welcome you in our third talk for the University of Minnesota School of Architecture lecture series for the spring 2022 semester. We're delighted to welcome Loretta and Ben Bosence, the directors of the Practice Local Works Studio. We are very excited for the contribution that you're about to make to the series and learning more about your work. Local Works Studio was founded in 2017 in the UK, and it's a practice which validates material, ecological, and social resources in new and important ways. Synthesizing the respective backgrounds of its directors, Local Works Studio benefits from an intimacy with both landscape and preservation practices. This special pairing of sensibilities, which is uncommon today, but perhaps typical of vernacular knowledge, manifests itself in the ways the studio approaches the very idea of sight. In their hands, figuratively and literally. Site-based resources are reanimated through landscape processes that, in their phrasing, plan, make, and repair. The unfolding outcomes of these processes are various, including the development of building components made of local waste, the revival of crafts for future-oriented material practices, and the orchestration of site maintenance and repair. In ongoing research, the studio also explores the relationship between territorial formations, community-based customs, and material resourcefulness. Giving shape to circularity, Local Works Studio situates its practice within a hidden wealth of plants and metabolic byproducts, chalk, seashells, clay, as well as discarded products, decommissioned infrastructures, and rubble. Loretta Bosence studied sculpture and photography at the Slade School of Fine Arts and landscape architecture at the University of Greenwich, where she won the Landscape Institute Student Dissertation Award. Prior to forming Local Works Studio, she led a garden design build practice employing her knowledge of horticulture, and she is currently a thesis supervisor at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. Ben Bosence studied ceramics and glass at the Royal College of Art in London, and is currently, was in the past a lecturer at the University of Brighton. Ben's endeavors in Local Works Studio are informed by his experience leading a building conservation and vernacular materials consultancy firm, as well as an architectural terracotta workshop. His work has been published in the Practical Building Conservation series, a comprehensive professional reference in the repair of historic buildings. Loretta, Ben, welcome once again. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a really nice introduction. I think you've covered a lot of our first bit of our lecture, actually.
Yeah, we're done.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're done. But no, thank you. Thanks for the invite. You're joining us live from our kitchen here in the UK. I think we just want to start by saying if there's any terminology which doesn't kind of make sense via translation kind of between the UK and America, we don't know where you're up to speed with certain things. So please let us know either at the sort of during or at the end of the talk. But no, thank you. Thanks for the invite for us to be here. Loretta and I are the co-directors and the founders of Local Works Studio. Loretta's landscape architect, and I'm a building craftsman with a background in architectural repair and building craft. And Local Works Studio is an ongoing conversation between the two of us. We design a large range of scales for landscapes and buildings. We design strategies, sites, features, we design materials, and also strategies for participation in design and construction. We're primarily motivated by concerns about the environment and social equality. We're trying to have a minimum negative impact on the wider environment, and we're trying to do the least we possibly, the least in a sense, whilst having the maximum positive impact to the lives of inhabitants and the wider environment. We are a small practice, so we have to kind of view that some of our projects are, I guess, like case studies, with a view to them being expanded either by us or by others in the future. We feel that our practice is different because we primarily focus on designing and building with the resources from the site or very, very nearby. And the resources can be materials, they can be crafts, or processes, waste and landscape byproducts. Just going to move the slide if we can. Oh yeah.
There we go. Yeah, so our approach is also slightly alternative because we try to make the process and the sort of routines and habits of building construction central to our practice. So rather than sort of more important than the end result itself. And we try to leverage those processes and operations of shaping a place, of design and construction to build capacity and capability in local communities, in small industries, individuals and ecological systems to enable them to function really well and flourish in a place. So this image here is, or the title of our lecture we called Habitual Design, and the picture here is of an area in Cornwall. It's a mining district, and it's this. We want to tell the story of this place because it's been an important reference for our practice since the beginning. So this is in Cornwall in southwest England. It's a tin mining district, and in the 18th century, a travelling Methodist preacher discovered a sort of sunken dip in this very sort of degraded landscape in the collapsed mine workings, and he felt that this was really great sort of natural amphitheatre for his open air sermons for people who become ostracised from the Church of England as Methodists. And in 1806, his congregation, who mostly from the mining community, altered the site to create this much more formal sort of amphitheatre as a sort of tribute to him. And they started by cutting terraces and then using field stones, which they collected on their way to the site, in their sort of gathered in their pinafores and their dresses of the sort of families travelling to worship at this site, and to bit by bit forming these beautiful terraces. And we feel like it's a perfect example of how, by working with limited resources and existing skills, you can empower a sort of marginalised group like this. And that is not to say that we want to romanticise poverty or the circumstances in which these places were built, but we feel like the story of this place, which is called Gwenap Pit, embodies the power of the vernacular to just with a very sort of I was going to say low budget, sounds not very good, in a very economical way, with low sort of carbon approach. A place can be shaped by ordinary people incrementally with their own tools and with the materials that they have to hand, and through the course of their daily lives over time, giving them agency and ownership. And so this, over time, this place became more and more popular. And here, this is a picture taken in 1957 of this place, which is shows what a huge congregation they became. They were walking miles across this very sort of rough landscape in their sort of Sunday best to gather in the place that they'd made together. And it's a real testament to the success of that sort of process.
So just moving on from that kind of inspirational place that we found, we've sort of developed a diagram to sum up our approach. And it's kind of linked by 3 main points for design, make and repair. And it is a very holistic kind of view approach to working, in that it's kind of cyclical. And we try to, with each project we do, we try to do research, we do an action, and then we do reflection. And that can carry on throughout the project. The sort of things that we can cover are sort of studying and observing the past and present routines and activities, gathering, preparation and testing of materials, creating connections between people, suppliers and makers, making and construction and maintenance and repair. So in this talk, we want to look at three kind of subjects, and we're going to illustrate those with some projects that we've completed, or current projects as well. And it's about creating good habits for a circular economy for building and dwelling. So the first thing, or the first kind of heading we're going to talk through is changing routines, strategies for intervention, and then we're going to talk about processing routines, about transforming waste through craft. And then finally, we'll cover regenerative routines, which is about designing for care and repair, which basically enables inhabitants to use their existing skills, tools and infrastructure.
So with changing routines, I want to talk about sort of the how we begin to try to understand a place and a context. So the people and industries and landscape and geology, the operations and processes that are happening in a place. And we try to ask what is working in a place and what isn't working. Where can we intervene in things, you know, perhaps sort of routines and habits that aren't working? And where are the sort of hidden opportunities? How can we intercept and redirect things? So I'm going to start by sharing some of our less picturesque aspects of some of our less picturesque projects, which are mainly sort of strategic, but they're also some of our most important. They're sort of quite large scale, some of them current. We can't really reveal too much about where they are, unfortunately, because of their strategic nature, but they allow us to talk about tools that we've used and developed to find the answers to some of the questions that I just outlined. So talking about dialogue, mapping and auditing. So the first thing that we do when we arrive in a place is try to really extensively engage with people and to listen to them, talking to, you know, as many people as possible, having loads and loads of conversations, meetings, long form interviews, workshops, trying to understand how the sort of networks of people in a place and community, sort of how they function, the skills that might exist and social infrastructure that may or may not exist, and the kind of routines that people, their sort of ordinary lives entail. And in the early days of our practice, we were working on several co-design projects for public realm, including one in an old market street in near central London with a practice called the Decorators. And during this process, I personally went through it and listened to hundreds of local residents. And this street has gone from a very sort of bustling, successful market street in the, you know, in the last sort of over the last century to very recently becoming quite sort of down at heel and underused and sometimes feeling unsafe to some people. And the market itself was really sort of dwindling. And so by speaking to people, you start to understand what the underlying issues that might be in a place. So talking to this man called Michael, sort of elderly resident, who explained to us that this street, which is lined with gates and which prevent people coming in when on market days, the market wasn't being properly managed by the council, and the gates were being left closed after market hours, which meant ambulances and fire crews couldn't get through to the block of flats where he lived. So he'd somehow managed to find a set of keys to the market gates and was going there at 4 p.m. every day to open them himself. And so it becomes sort of interesting to see how people's lives intersect with the kind of the official line of a place, and how the management of a place, how, you know, things like the bins being left out and not being taken away, the kind of the management of the market itself, how those issues can be more important to the public than the actual sort of aesthetics of the place, and somehow that it's important to sort of address those, and some of the ways that money is being spent in a place, as well as the design. So how can we create new, better habits as a sort of first step in any sort of design process, and acknowledging the concerns of people rather than sweeping them under the carpet and saying, it's all right, we'll make it pretty for you. So we also worked in a very large development in East London, developing a placemaking strategy and we worked with a team of people who were not just designers, but also lots of local residents who we worked with over a period of about 4 months, but also community researchers, curators, entrepreneurs and healthcare consultants to develop a really rounded view of the place. And in both the case of the Market Street and this development, we were working on trying to develop design principles that would address some of these underlying problems, but try to address them in a sort of spatial way in this particular case in the placemaking strategy. So we developed some interventions that might change habits of people and try to make their lives easier, basically, in this very sort of, so far, not very lived in place. Oh. Yeah. So we're working on ways that can sort of, you can create an open framework for design, which is flexible and can respond to the way people live their lives or the way they want to live their lives. And it entails taking on different roles. So as a designer, we come first to site as a citizen, and we have to engage with issues larger than just kind of what things look like and how they function spatially. So sort of economics of a place, policy, environment, even sort of, you know, healthcare, so thinking about social prescribing, how public life is working, how the relationships in a place are working, and what we can do to sort of work with those things. So the next tool is mapping, which is really essential to our practice, and it allows us to express layers of sort of meaning and uncover missed opportunities. So we'll look at archives, historic maps, geological maps, planning documents, utilities, national statistics, population data, even sort of more informal data from social and community organisations. Even looking at sort of local newspapers and, you know, websites and community blogs and things like that, and trying to map those layers and spatialising some of that data and considering all the sort of all the dimensions, not just a sort of plan view of a site, but looking at sort of, you know, thinking about elevation and, you know, a place over time, and trying to see what materials that we might be able to begin to find, what skills, what operational sort of opportunities might arise in space or time, and to see where the waste is, where things are going and where they shouldn't be, in intervening and preventing that waste. So these maps are of a place in southeast London called Erith, which is right on the periphery of the city, right by where the sort of the large sort of trunk roads that circle London are. And we were commissioned by a community centre who were doing some works outside their centre to create some sort of landscape features and brick works. So through this mapping exercise, it started to reveal a correlation between there's a lot of development going on in this place, but the correlations between this development work and some of the utilities and infrastructure works that were going on, so digging trenches for roadworks, and then looking at the layers of geological, the underlying geological layers, which in some places in this area contain this very valuable sort of clay, which known as Crayford brick earth, which was used historically to sort of create a lot, you know, the majority of some of the bricks in the city of London, which those sort of clay sites have now sort of closed, but we could see that where roadworks were happening, and when, you know, finding out when they were happening, if we sort of mapped that, then we could find places that we could actually get this clay that was essentially going to waste. So when they dig it up, it can't be used again in the road, it has to be taken and dumped. When the foundations are dug under the buildings, that clay is taken away and dumped as well. So we wanted to try and intercept that clay by finding out when the utilities vehicles, these giant sort of hoovers, would come along and, or vacuum cleaners, am I using the right term? Would come and suck up the clay from all these trenches in one day, because the truck is so expensive, it could only go down and remove the clay from each of these places all in one go.
Yeah, I guess.
So we chased this lorry and got the clay for this site.
Yeah, this kind of shows some initial brick tests that we did. We do a lot of prototyping and sampling in our workshop. But I just wanted to sort of, I was thinking it as Loretta was talking then, that we try to learn from the vernacular. And in this case, the vernacular, the kind of historic buildings and landscapes are built with a very limited material palette, because you only work with what you have. So to make these bricks, there is a very limited palette of materials. So we managed to gain this brick earth from the kind of gas main roadside diggings, but we were blending that material with construction and demolition waste from the project. So they were crushing up red bricks and yellow bricks, and we were able to kind of mix these up and test them in our kiln. This is the building, the art centre, run by the community in Erith, and it's actually really close to the Thames as well, close to the river. But the bricks that we were making are for the garden. They're paver bricks for the landscape, to create hard landscaping for the garden. Oh, it's not moving. Gone past on. There we go. So through the work, we put on a community making event and invited local people to come and make a brick for the garden, and they could customize them as they wanted to. But it was a really interesting workshop to do, partly because it is such a historic area for brick making, and some of the people who came had family who had experience of making bricks many generations ago. But it's a very kind of easy process for people to kind of take on board and make bricks, which was good fun. The bricks were fired in it's called a clamp, which is a traditional way of firing bricks with no kiln. So you could basically, the brickmakers followed the construction sites. So this is an image of some guys who stuck in the clamp before firing. In Erith, yeah. Another tool that we have alongside the mapping is auditing materials for reuse. Now this can kind of come across as quite a kind of dry list of things which are found on a particular site, but I think we try to do it in a more creative way. We can create pre-deconstruction audits, which becomes a design tool for the whole process for the project. This particular audit was in southwest England again, in Devon, and it's a 55-acre farm, so they do have their own land, and this is a shot from it. It was pretty standard agricultural land, which they were trying to rewild and basically create more biodiversity on the site. So this is an image of a recently dug beaver pond, and they've released beavers into the wild here, which is kind of a big news story in the UK at the moment.
We have no beavers.
Yeah, there's lots of beaver rewilding projects at the moment, but this is one of them. And it just sort of shows the kind of makeup of the landscape, I guess. There's clay found locally. There's also kind of timber plantation alongside the agricultural stuff. This shows a drawing that Loretta made, which kind of shows the site, and it shows our radial mapping and auditing. Specifically, this is kind of overlaid on top of a geology map, but it does show kind of fabricators, farmers, suppliers, processors, small batch producers. And they're possibly not kind of linked or working together at the moment, but we're trying to sort of form these links, or understand at least links that could be made between these kind of small scale industries looking at waste and byproducts, which could enable construction on this site.
Yeah, we should probably say that this farm is being converted, or some of the farm buildings are being converted into residential dwellings, but also potentially into sort of workshops for more sort of communal making situation.
Yeah. So I guess we kind of view an audit as putting together or starting to understand a viable material palette for a project. There's a delay again, just waiting for it to change. So here is a sheet from our report, which looks on the left-hand side at materials and features that are particularly at the site, which could be useful for reuse. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking slightly wider into other features and materials and byproducts and waste that could also be used for construction works. So once you kind of have an overview, we tend to delve in a bit deeper and look through each kind of type of material. So this is just another page from an audit report detailing that that wheat grown on the local farms we found was actually being grown a historic variety, which is very long stemmed wheat, which is really, they grew it for thatch. So for thatching roofs and walls, it was a really good product, but also for building insulation, to create a kind of breathable, natural insulation material. So it's kind of looking at opportunities to tie into these local materials which are already there and perhaps could have got missed. They might not have a website or kind of a high profile of kind of as a company. So it's good to kind of really delve into the sort of what is available locally.
But also to look at how sort of an older traditional craft can have an application for modern architecture as well. So looking at the ways that can be transformed and trying to sort of, you know, take the best from some of the older crafts and try to sort of apply them sort of low carbon modern design. Yeah,
I think we just say here, we're using precedents here.
This isn't our work,
on the right hand side. And then kind of, there's something kind of almost polar opposite in a way. We have a current project in the centre of London, so very, very urban site. And it is a turn of the century, so 1903 stone building, which is going to undergo some major reconfiguration works. And we're producing an audit for this site to ensure that materials are not lost as waste, and to ensure that there is some kind of actual on-site, not only on-site storage, but on-site altering and changing of materials. So you can actually create a kind of workshop for the duration of the project. So our role is specifically to look at the stonework on the building. The exterior is clad in a Portland stone from the south coast of England, but the interior is kind of lined with Italian marbles, which was kind of the, I guess, the fashion at the time. So we're looking at all of these materials being kept on site, altered and used for the reconfiguration works. So we're looking at a fabrication strategy. There's been a what's known as a soft strip inside, so they've lost the kind of carpets and the ceiling tiles and the kind of internal partition work. But we're looking at these kind of spaces, kind of taking over a floor to create a workshop on the site, which kind of stops materials getting lost as waste. This is a view on the left-hand side down one of the light wells of the building. And then on the right-hand side, at the top is a quarry in Italy where the marble came from initially, and then a quarry in Portland where the limestone came from. But I think what we're trying to do with this project is understand that you can mine a building. A building is a material store. And that material has enormous value. You know, you've lost carbon in its creation, in its initial creation. But if you deconstruct carefully, you can ensure that these materials can be reused, and means you don't have to bring in more carbon heavy materials in the future. So the next thing we want to look at in the talk is processing routines, transforming waste with craft. We have a project at the moment that's been going on for about 2, maybe 3 years now. In Belgium, there's a city, Ghent in Belgium. And this is the Design Museum in Ghent. It's a very important building for the city, but it's being extended. So there's a brand new extension put onto this historic building. And the museum was very keen to kind of create a very low carbon story for the project. And we were brought in initially as kind of material specialists to inform the project in that way, but we also looked at fabrication strategies as well. And our brief was to create a white brick for the facade of this new extension. And it was kind of had to be done at scale. There was 91,000 bricks required for the extension. And we wanted to look at how materials and waste from the city could be transformed into a brick, but maybe not a traditional brick, which is fired in a kiln and has pollution issues. We wanted to fabricate very, very locally to the site with no pollution, to create a very kind of urban product. So to stop materials being transported around. There is a historic kind of brickmaking industry in Ghent, but also because it's a very low-lying country, they had to drain the water to create the cities. And we were looking at these excavation materials in order to make the bricks. So the extension itself needed excavation works to form a basement and foundations. And this material that came up, this lovely kind of fine silt, was a really good starting point as a material that would inevitably come from the construction that we could form into bricks. So we fabricated some prototypes for the project. There's no sense in us making 91,000 bricks in the UK to then send back to Belgium. So we are basically prototyping for this project, and then the fabrication will happen very close to the site. But they are hydraulic pressed bricks, so there's no pollution from the making of them. And these have been kind of made into a testing panel at the Design Museum, and they're undergoing testing at the University of Ghent for compressive strength and frost resistance at the moment. So we partnered with a company called BC Materials, who are based in Belgium. They're based in Brussels, actually, which is kind of the next city to Ghent. And they are able to take on this project at scale and very local to the Design Museum.
Isn't it all within 7 kilometres
of
the site?
It's all within 7 kilometres of the site. So this is kind of this fabrication strategy that we helped to design with them. And there's no kiln, there's no firing. The bricks are pressed hydraulically to create a strong material.
Did you mention that it's Commodity Walk?
Yeah, the architects. The architects are a UK firm called Commodity Walk, and they are partnered with a Belgian firm called Trans.
So this is a smaller scale project that's somewhere in a town called Southampton. It's a Maggie Centre, which is a cancer care centre. It was commissioned, so we were commissioned by Maggie Centres to make some features for the sort of externally to the building, which would fit with the design of the building, which is by Amanda Levette Architects, and with the landscape design from Sarah Price. And so when we arrived at the site, there was already construction going on in the top left-hand corner. And we found that there was a lot of surplus materials that were already kind of coming up from the site. So these bespoke features that have been made for these ceramic fins that go on the cladding of the building, and also sort of over-ordered gravel. And looking wider from the site, we wanted to find some sort of softer materials, because we were looking at making chairs, which so we wanted to find something a bit more sort of comfortable. And a couple of miles away from the site is the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service headquarters, and we discovered that they had a sort of a waste stream of fire hose, which is very sort of resilient material. It can be left outside, but only has a life of 10 years, after which they can't be used by the fire crews anymore. And we also looked, because it's Southampton has a lot of marinas by the sea, there's a lot of sail makers and boat builders, so we found there was a lot of redundant sailcloth, which we also experimented with. So our practice, I guess, in terms of how we transform this sort of waste using craft, this kind of real sort of routine of processing and experimenting, we tried to sort of invent new materials by sort of applying some of our material knowledge. So looking on the left, we tried to create a low carbon concrete using these sort of recycled materials into a composite. And then also looking at how we could transform some of the more unusual ways, like the fire hose, by applying sort of traditional crafts, sort of transferring those skills from other things. There's somebody in our workshop who's a weaver. So she made this amazing twill weave of fire hose to create the back of these.
I guess we kind of used it like leather, didn't we? It was,
yeah.
So like you say, using traditional craft techniques and tools, you can kind of use this plastic-based hose, but working it like leather.
Yeah, so we started to create value in these kind of quite sort of mundane or ugly materials just through this kind of care and attention. And one of the important aspects of this project was working with this company called Making It Out, who work with ex-offenders and repeat offenders who are finding it hard to get back into the workplace. And we worked with them to do the metalwork for some chairs. And I think the sort of value of working with those can't be sort of underestimated out of those kind of people, because it allows, well, I think you have to have a certain degree of tolerance in the way you design to be able to work with people who are not necessarily as skilled as a sort of fully professional outfit, but the sort of benefits of doing that, who you sort of commission to do things, really matters. It matters to us anyway.
Well, it just has a bigger, wider impact into kind of teaching them new skills.
Yeah, and it creates jobs, you know. So I think when this is the sort of end result of some of the work that we did there, so we made tables and chairs and reclining chairs and things. So the ceramic pieces we used as they were. So without any kind of processing, which is really good, because that's, you know, the lowest carbon sort of outcome possible. So we use that as a structure for the table, then the composite concrete and these chairs. I should say the Making It Out did all the steel work, and we did try to work with use reed bar using reinforced concrete from the site, but the Maggie centres weren't so keen on that. I felt that was a bit rough and ready for them, so they decided we just went with recycled steel bar instead. But you can see from the results of this that this kind of process of working with materials from the site and sort of applying this craft to it can end up really lovely results that really sort of, it sits so well with the building, sort of seamlessly with the building and its sort of material palette.
Okay, we're going to talk about the last item is regenerative routines, designing for care. I think the sort of thing to start with this is, can we learn from the vernacular, from vernacular buildings and crafts without being over romantic? And really kind of introduce maintenance and repair into projects. Basically, we found that if somebody asks for a low maintenance solution, you're basically dealing with very high carbon materials that will last forever. So if you open it up to being, if you open up the opportunities for maintenance and repair, you're allowing softer, kind of more regenerative materials to be used, so with a much lower carbon outcome. We've been working for many years actually with, this is a museum called Charleston, and it is a historic farmhouse in Sussex, very near to our studio actually. But it became kind of famously the home of the Bloomsbury group, which are a group of artists from London who came down, as this is kind of their country pad, their kind of country retreat. And they took this kind of very...
In the 1920s.
Yeah, it was kind of between the walls. Yeah. But they really kind of went to town on this house, and they painted the interiors really beautifully. They painted the fireplaces, the floors, the ceilings, the furniture. And luckily it's been saved and has become a really important kind of example of this artist's work, these artists' work. So we've been working to repair and conserve the building for a long time. There's many visitors that come and walk around, and the building was never made for a huge quantity of people. So there's kind of always ongoing repairs to the fabric of the building.
That ceiling had collapsed, isn't it?
Yeah, basically a ceiling had collapsed on the first floor, and I'm sure you have it in America as well in older properties, but this was pre-plasterboard, pre-dry lining, gypsum board. So the ceilings and all the plasterwork are made from timber laths, and then traditional lime plaster applied in 3 coats. Again, a very limited material palette made from the landscape. So the laths are made from chestnut, sweet chestnut timber. That's the sort of first ingredient for a ceiling. The second ingredient is chalk or limestone, which is burnt to make a lime, and that is combined with aggregate or sand or crushed chalk to make a lime plaster. And then the third ingredient is animal hair that's put into the plasterwork, and that's kind of like a fibre, a strengthener, but also allows it to be flexible. And the reason that the ceiling had failed was down to kind of an incorrect repair about kind of 30 years ago. So we kind of looked really as a kind of tighter radius as we possibly could to gain these 3 materials: the animal hair, the timber for the laths, and the chalk for the lime plasterwork. And we worked initially with a community woodland very nearby who had this sweet chestnut timber, which is perfect for the laths. And this is an image of us talking to the forester. But crucially, this timber is grown in what we call a coppice management technique. So a particular tree, a sweet chestnut, can exist for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years.
No,
hundreds of years, but is cropped and it is harvested above the ground. So the same root ball carries on and then regrows. And it's done on a cyclical 15-year rotation for a coppice. And what you normally do is go around a woodland in patches, felling, moving on. Next year you fell the next bit. So you get these different stages of regrowth within a woodland, which is great for biodiversity. So we tapped into this woodland to gain our sweet chestnut.
We should probably say it's like a community-run woodland. So in the first slide there, you can see it's become actually quite overgrown, and that the canopies all, at one point it was being managed, and then it got completely left. And so the canopy is all the same height. So without that structural diversity, it's much less biodiverse. So the community group had got together and employed a forester to try to make sure that they could restore this woodland. And in doing so, there was a lot of timber coming up.
Yeah. So this is some of the sweet chestnut that's felled. It's always done, well, in the southeast of England, it is done in February, before the sap starts to rise for new growth. So there's kind of frost on this image, I think. But that's the kind of traditional time to fell the timber.
I just wanted to add, sorry, that timber is being, at the moment, there is no economic stream for this timber because it's low grade, because it hasn't been looked after, so it's a bit wonky, slightly imperfect. But they're felling a lot of it, and there's no people working with chestnut locally. There's a few sort of fencers, but Tom told us through this kind of dialogue that we discovered that all of this timber was going to be burnt as biofuel. So it was essentially, really going to waste. It's really, chestnut is a great durable timber that can be used internally and externally. Yeah, just wanted to say that.
So the image on the left is obviously Tom felling the sweet chestnut for us, and then you can see the image on the right is later on in the spring. So this is probably a full first year's growth actually, but it really does regrow from what's called the stool, the bottom section of the trunk, very, very quickly, and is absolutely amazing at carbon sequestration as well. Sequestration. So that was the timber. Oh, here we are in what looks like kind of devastation, but is actually a really beautifully managed woodland where they leave the standing oaks, the bigger trees which are left to kind of keep that big canopy. but all the sweet chestnut is felled down to the kind of almost just above ground level. And then I spent a couple of days in this woodland splitting the chestnut into the laths you can see in the foreground, the plastering laths. And then the next two ingredients to make or remake the ceiling was the chalk from the landscape. And Charleston is right next to the South Downs Way, which is an amazing, beautiful chalk ridge that runs 100 miles across the southeast of England. So we gathered this from a local farm that was digging up the chalk anyway for excavation work, and we were able to fire the chalk in a kiln, temporary kiln that we made to make the lime. And then we gathered horsehair from a local stables through kind of grooming of the manes of these horses. They take up this lovely long length strand of hair, which we could add as fibre to the lime plaster. And then this was a sort of image of me applying the first coat onto the ceiling. You can see the build up with the sweet chestnut laths. And actually the wonky nature of them helps in that it's a much better key for the plaster to grip onto. So if you have kind of like machine cut laths, they're actually too smooth and kind of can debond from the plaster.
And that's why it failed.
Yeah, this is why it failed initially.
So, I mean, it's probably important to say that the reason we did this was partly as a sort of an exemplar, as, can you do this? Can you take a building and repair it just using the materials that come to hand from a landscape? But also, that as an alternative, it would be to go to a builder's merchants, maybe specialising in heritage crafts, which would import the lath from, I'm not sure where, and sawn lath perhaps, or importing chestnut from somewhere further away from the site, but also bringing in limestone or lime burnt elsewhere, which would be not necessarily as high quality as what we'd created. So the last project we're talking about is something that we didn't design this site or make it initially. It was made about 12 years ago by community members. It's called Wild About Barkham. It's a community wild space with an orchard and play space in it. And we undertook to care and repair for this site, working with local people, volunteers on a very low budget, and trying to bring those people along with us on the journey of kind of how to sort of regenerate this site for the long term, so that it could be looked after for a long period. Because I think initially it failed to be looked after because after several years the council weren't looking after it and people ran out of energy for it. So we wanted to create a routine for looking after the site, which would be fun to be involved in, and it would be meaningful to be involved in, and would have some sort of longevity, because we shared skills with people and made sure that every intervention that we have designed subsequently, or any repair that we've designed, has been we've tried to include people in that. We haven't designed them out by making things too difficult. So we've tried to work with available skills, or at least use skills that are easily passed on between people, and working with tools that people have and infrastructure that we already have, and building a sort of local knowledge as we go along, and a capacity and capability is what makes this really sort of work as a strategy. So we've been doing it for about 6 years now, and despite a sort of a gap over COVID, it's still going really strong. And so we tried to make it a fun process by creating sort of events in the calendar that people can come along and volunteer, and there is always some sort of fun activity with that, so like a summer barbecue or apple pressing or whatever. And children have grown up watching this, so they come along with parents, or just they've happened to come along, and they've watched and joined in with the more sort of fun activities, but never really got stuck into the sort of the building of the site. But in our most recent sort of clear up day, a group of teenagers who've grown up watching all this work taking place, and also have occupied the site themselves as children, sort of playing, and now as teenagers as a place to sort of go in a rural situation. And they totally unexpectedly took on a job of clearing around a pond and creating this willow fence without any kind of instruction or kind of intervention from adults. And they really felt they took sort of ownership of the place by, I think, through that period of time where they'd just observed and sort of through a process of osmosis had sort of had worked out how that they could have the power to change the place themselves. And I think that is the real value of a project which places maintenance at its heart. It not only allows you to use these kind of lower spec kind of or less resilient materials which are lower carbon, because it allows you to kind of intervene at more regular intervals, but it also allows people to have a kind of a sense of belonging and agency in creating a place and shaping it over time. And there's real sort of benefits to individual well-being and community well-being in that you sort of put this place at the center of, you know, a community's life. And there are better results for people. It's the beauty in the place is not necessarily kind of, you know, there's individual things there which are quite pretty, like this willow fence, but the beauty is it comes from this kind of attention and care that people put in it. And you can walk around and see that people love the place, and it brings you get to use a richer, more diverse material palette, which is also really can be very beautiful. So to finish, I'd like to say that I think, like Ursula Le Guin, who's a science fiction writer, we subscribe to the carrier bag theory of human evolution. So where the most important hidden narrative of the development of humankind is not the heroic tale of man versus beast, and the triumphant hero killing the mammoth with his spear, but the more mundane story of someone patiently, routinely gathering oat after tiny oat until their bag is full, ready to take home to be eaten and stored and shared with others in times of scarcity.
We're not sure if we've got enough time. We have actually, we couldn't quite fit it into the talk. We couldn't see where we could slot it in, but we could very kind of quickly talk about the oyster shell work we've done, but I'm not sure. I wanted to check with you first if there is time, or if you wanted to move on straight to questions or not.
There's time, yeah.
Okay, cool.
We haven't
rehearsed this. It's fine. So for the last kind of probably 4 to 5 years, kind of taking on work that I started or kind of at least witnessed back when I had my building conservation practice, we've been looking at ways that buildings had been built using shell waste. And we studied this in sort of southwest Cornwall. I travelled to the Faroe Islands, which are a kind of very isolated group of islands in the Atlantic Ocean. And I haven't seen it in person, but I've read a lot about it on the east coast of America. There's a long tradition of using oyster shells to create buildings. It's mostly done where there is a real lack of bedrock limestone. So the shell material is chemically similar to a limestone, so you can burn the shell to make lime. So we kind of, I guess, first did it as a sort of real life project with the University of Brighton, where we were tasked to create a kind of rainproof cladding for a very experimental building in Brighton
called the
Waste House, which is built from waste. The black is actually sort of turned around carpet tiles as the cladding. But we produced a panel of oyster tiles, which are still there, and they've sort of been ongoing tested on this building, on the north face of this building.
So it's supposed to be, the idea behind this project was to work with a firm called Veolia, who are a waste management firm, to work with waste streams in the city. So some of those waste streams, we were looking at insulation with duvets, the potential of that, which is not quite our sort of area of expertise, but we also found a waste stream coming from restaurants where people were throwing away oyster shells. It's not a huge waste stream, but I think we were interested in it because it's regenerative.
Yeah, I think
oysters grow back.
Yeah, and I think in other countries, especially in America, there's a really amazing amount of work being done to repurpose waste oyster shell or waste shell from fish restaurants back into making a false reef for new oysters or seashells to grow on. But that doesn't exist in the UK. So food waste goes straight into the black bin, as we call it, and it goes straight to landfill. So for the kind of summer of 2018, we collected oyster shells from fish restaurants in Brighton. And these tiles, the white ones are made from 100% oyster shell. So they're a mix of crushed shell, which kind of replaces sand in a mix. And then the rest is lime. So the burnt oyster shell as lime, which is the binder, the concrete. And that's it in terms of materials. The pinker ones have brick waste in them as well. And we kind of, I guess we try to do this for a lot of our work. We want the surface of any material we design or make to be readable. So you need to kind of, if you want to, you can delve into the surface and try to work out what it's made of. So these tiles are polished like a terrazzo finish to show the shell waste and the brick waste. We also did another project last year with an artist in the UK
called Something and
called
Son.
Something and Son. And this was, we created a false reef made from waste oysters and other shell materials you can see on here. And this is a kind of like it's sort of imagine like a giant donut, ring donut, which was like a big heavy lump, which would be sunk to the bottom of a dock, seaside dock.
Says that the inside is made of this shell-based concrete, rather than it's not just shells stuck to concrete.
Yeah, the whole thing is made out of shells in its entirety. And the idea is that this kind of lump, this donut, would anchor the rest of the sculpture. And the idea was that hopefully over time this would increase the biodiversity in this area. So this is just a shot of the false reef being lowered into the sea, and these ropes would then kind of float up vertically, and hopefully mussels would grow on these ropes. And then just to finish, this is an image, not our image at all, but it's an image from the east coast of America. And this is a traditional oyster rick, it's called, which is kind of like a clamp. And this is how they burnt the oyster shell to create the lime. So wood obviously is the fuel. And this was done to create a specific process or structure made called tabbycrete, which is a solid kind of cast wool material made from oyster shells burnt to create the lime. But this is how I wanted to put it in, because it's from the USA, but this is their traditional way of burning the oyster shell.
We're also, we haven't got any slides to show this, but we're working with some designers up in northern Scotland on the Hebridean Islands, because they're looking to make some new buildings with features inside them and cladding using this shellcrete. So we're trying to look at the opportunities here for working with people who work in the shellfish industry. So these industries are seasonal, and when people aren't working, then they, especially in the islands where there's very little work, people have like 3 or 4 jobs at a time. So we're looking to create a kind of an economic sort of stream for them and a supply chain, so that you can use some of the skills that they have for other jobs in creating stuff with shellcrete.
Okay, I think that's it. If there, I don't know if there's 3 comments. I don't know if there's any questions on the chat.
That was amazing. Yes, thank you so much. We will definitely take the questions. That was brilliant. Thank you again. I'm just going to turn on the light so that we have the space here in the school set up also. Okay, great. So yes, we have some comments in the Zoom actually, and I just want to also let the audience here at the school know that you can also ask a question. It doesn't have to be through the Zoom, but you will have to come up to the podium to pose your question, which maybe takes a bit more courage, but quite a bit more fun also, instead of just typing it. So
We'd like to see some people.
Yeah, we'd love to see you.
Yeah,
Should we take our
exactly.
thing? Maybe should we stop sharing and then we can see more people, perhaps? I don't know.
Yeah, and I can rotate this so that you can also see some people.
Oh, look, see ourselves. Woo.
Yeah. It will be a bit more sociable.
Lovely.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, so maybe we can start with the questions on the Zoom. So there's a question from Mary Begley. Are you able to see the question? I think you can see it.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a project where it felt
Yeah.
like there were no materials or processes to take inspiration from? I don't think so.
Not yet.
Unless we sort of did a project on like Mars, but even then that would be like, you probably have quite a lot of moon rock.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
always something. I think we're kind of, I guess we're blessed here in that there's so many layers of history in the UK that we can kind of draw on. But even if there was none of that, even if it was a kind of, there would be materials, and it's about kind of learning to be kind of ingenious with a limited palette, I guess. You have to really kind of work out what a material can do. You've got to push it to its kind of like extremes, I guess, to get it to do what you need.
I suppose at first we found working in cities harder, because if you're in a landscape situation, there's quite a lot going on, quite diverse sort of materials available on the surface. But then actually, you know, our cities are like, you know, basically standing forests of timber and, you know, and kind of quarries of, you know, there's a lot to, I guess in the future, perhaps once people get it together to design for reuse a bit more and design for disassembly, and they start to be much stricter about what materials we can throw away, then there might become a time where it is much more difficult to design in cities with, you know, using waste. But then, you know, great.
But also I think the hardest thing that we find is storage, especially in an urban setting, because once something is transported away from a place, you've really kind of lost it. It's become labelled as waste, and it becomes very hard to gain that back again. And I think that's something I've really learned from working on, specifically on conservation building sites, which are run in a very, very different way to a modern construction site, where materials are given huge value because they are, in a sense, they're archaeology. So the people make space to store, things just don't leave, you know, because they have so much value. So I think that's kind of, the storage is the main issue we've come up against as a kind of hindrance to reuse.
I see. Fantastic. That's amazing. There's another question from a student here, Jay Kamala. Maybe you want to pose the question. You knew I was going to ask you. There's a student, he posted in the Zoom, but he's actually here.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for coming. I really love the work, and there's sort of like a lot of things to think about. There are a lot of projects where I'm just like, it's badass, like just making things and like coming in and just doing sort of the routines. I was just wondering about sort of if you could talk more about like perfection and imperfection, especially bringing in like labor and the human hand. I think as like a student, you really get into that feeling where it's like, it's got to be this way, but like a lot of things that you show really have like the human touch come out of it. And I was really interested in sort of that relationship in your practice.
Good question.
I guess we certainly see the value in that and the beauty in that. But I guess maybe that's one of the challenging things about what we do, because a lot of architecture, especially, as you know, they're used to dealing with standard materials and having warranties for things and making sure that everything is, you know, above board. And I think that's one of the big challenges, is how do you make sure that things can be used and sort of, but I think it's also about challenging, you know, to what extent things really do need to be guaranteed. You know, if you can perhaps, as well as specifying the material, you can specify the way it's handled and the way it's repaired and the way it's maintained, then you have more ability to say, well, you know, yes, I think that's the real value of having, you know, Ben coming from a conservation background, is that that's never a problem in working conservation. It's not like,
No.
oh no, well, that, you know, that cob wall is definitely going to fall down after, you know, 50 years. And we say, well, yeah, of course it is. So that's why in, you know, 10 years we'll be coming back to look after it. It's just not sort of, I think so, there's so much, especially in landscape architecture and architecture, there's so much weight put on low maintenance. You know, we have this capital budget, we've got to spend it now, and there's no money for maintenance into the future. And I think it's our job to sort of challenge that, because it's, if you ask for something that's low maintenance, you're asking for something that's completely bomb-proof and is totally over-specified. And I think when people design for architecture, they, especially, you know, thinking about timber and the grades of timber that you use, I don't know if it's the same in the US as the UK, but there's lots of different grades of timber, and I think they're massively over-specified because everybody's so scared that they're going to get, you know, taken to court because, you know, something's failed, when actually it would have been perfectly fine with a lower grade timber, which could have been got locally or whatever. You know.
I think it's also good to point out that there are kind of, in modern construction especially, there's so many layers, unless what I feel like unnecessary layers to a building, like the kind of the plaster, then the paint, then the sealer, then the varnish, then the, you know, blah 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 that goes on. And I think we're probably more interested in the materials, keeping them raw, and not putting on unnecessary coatings. You know, maybe you don't need a paint. If you have a plaster made from the clay from the site, it has a beautiful colour in itself. You don't need to go again with another coating, which contains plastic and formaldehyde and horrible things. So I think, yeah, it's just a really good question, because the hand of the maker is such a kind of tactile thing. And I think if you walk around a builder's merchant, so in this country where you go to buy your building products, it's the slickest, kind of shiniest, kind of over-engineered products available, and there's nothing, there's no reference in anything on the shelves to the hand of the maker. You cannot see who made it. It's all machine made. It's all machine finished with lots and lots of layers on top of it.
But I think that's part of the commodification of things, is that you can't see what the origin is. So you're supposed to forget where it's come from. You're supposed to forget the consequences of you're sort of consuming this material. You know, you're not supposed to notice that this has come from some, you know, mountain or mine, you know, 6,000 miles away, and it's been dug out by somebody who's not been paid properly. And you're supposed to just see this thing as it's floating in from nowhere, that you'll just, you know, make your facade of your building look fantastic.
Yeah. But another, I guess we're really going into this one, but another kind of thing to say is that if you keep materials in their raw state, not only can you kind of reuse them, but you're not chemically bonding them forever. That you can dismantle stuff and you can use it in a different way. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly the same application, but it allows that careful deconstruction and reuse.
So even with composite materials like lime, so, you know, like cement, you can't take apart. Once it's stuck, it's stuck. But with lime, you can
reuse the bricks. You can clean the brick. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. That another question has come through from Elliot. Thank you so much for this talk. Beautiful work. As an architect, I wondered how you deal with regulation, fire, thermal. I understand from your talk that a museum like Ghent will pay for engineering tests. What about other architects or DIYers who would like to experiment and specify such products? I have just a quick anecdote. I also tried to use an old brick once, and we had to have it tested. It turns out the old brick, which was discarded, was several times more frost resistant and had higher compressive strength than like a contemporary brick.
Yeah, it's bonkers. Yeah, I think when you have something as big scale as this job we have in Belgium, which is creating this new brick for a new facade, and it's a public building, there's kind of huge risk involved. There was a grant that the architects managed to source to enable further experimentation and testing of the materials, which is great. And that has really helped progress this kind of other way of working. But yeah, I've been involved on various materials testing fireproof, compressive strength, frost strengths, etc. And it is possible, but I think it's kind of, you also have to open up the debate about risk. You have to have that talk. You know, who will take the risk? Why is it seen as risk? There has to be a kind of debate as well as doing the necessary testing if needed. But I think you need to talk about it.
I think it also helps to take things slowly and bit by bit. So if, you know, it might be a bit of a tall order to make an entire building out of local materials, completely all, you know, meeting all regulations and completely tested. But I think you just do what you can in that situation and try to sort of, you know, push the envelope a bit with, say, one particularly viable material. And there's, you know, I think we worked with Ghent, University of Ghent, to do some of the testing. So I think there's building these kind of relationships with other people with expertise who want, you know, everybody wants to actually do the right thing. And I think there's a lot of goodwill. So I think it's worth building these relationships and trying to find allies that can help. It's not easy, it's got to be said, but it's, you know, it's definitely sort of moving very quickly in this direction.
That's amazing. Thank you. There's a question that you just started touching on now. A question, can you talk about the partnership with other groups in terms of whether you have the project first and wanting to experiment, or how you decide to partner with different companies and how that relates to the material experimentations?
I guess it's a mixture, isn't it? It's like how we...
I mean, we aim to come in very early to a project because we've had experience of coming in later and material has already gone. And waste has been created and it's disappeared and we can't access it. So we always aim to come in early.
I think it's definitely about bringing in people from who you might traditionally, in a sort of linear construction sort of time frame, you might get these people involved at the very end, you know, sort of contractors, demolition people, and try to work with them from the beginning as well. So it's not sort of this kind of exclusive top-down, very sort of design heavy process at the beginning. It's very open to bringing in as many people who already have the knowledge that you need to get involved.
Yeah, fascinating.
We are definitely a small practice, so we do look to collaborate wherever possible because we don't have all the skills. We have quite a kind of specific skill set. So we are always, you know, open and looking to collaborate with people to enable bigger projects to happen.
Fantastic. Maybe I'll pose one more question and then we can wrap up, which has to do with, I guess there's a project that you've been working on, local code, which has to do with somehow planning and how planning processes are related to material processes. And what's fascinating is that somehow in the process of making a site-based building, you're also shaping the landscape. And so there's somehow a reciprocal relationship between the surroundings, literally the territory, and then the constructions that are being built. In the work so far, you have kind of, you find certain places, and then those materials become the raw material for new constructions or repair of existing buildings. Do you see, I guess, how do you see that relationship between the territory and the material, and how the design of one affects the design of the other, and vice versa?
It's quite a big question. I guess more and more we're thinking that, you know, something that we want to do more of is looking more at regenerative processes. So I think you know, like we obviously work a lot with waste, because that's quite often the dilemma that people have, sort of first of all. But I think to try to find, we're starting on a sort of research project at the moment called Building in the Symbiocene. So that's kind of imagining an era beyond the Anthropocene, which, you know, we've kind of created this new geological time by interfering so much with kind of geology and the sort of working of the earth. But try to imagine a new kind of phase where we're working sort of symbiotically in everything that we do. So taking sort of almost kind of looking forwards and backwards at the same time. a point where not, and I don't mean just in a technological kind of biomimicry kind of a way, but but in a kind of a more I don't know, sort of human way, very personal way, trying to find ways to work with things without always considering the need to extract. Perhaps, you know, thinking about recognizing when you have enough already, and recognizing the sort of abundance that exists already, and being much more careful with what you have. I'm a major fan of a US author called Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's written about the kind of something she calls the honourable harvest, a sort of an indigenous approach to landscape, which is something where you will always consider that it's almost like the landscape and the things within it, sort of non-human things, are people just as much as we are, and they have their own sort of rights. And you would never consider just going and taking everything and not allowing it to sort of regenerate itself, but also you would never take something without giving back something. So I think that's more and more how we would like to approach our project. So looking at plant-based materials especially, I think.
I think also it's crucial that we don't, through designing with waste and byproducts, that you don't give kind of legitimacy to that waste. So that is always a danger, and it's a fine line sometimes. But really, I guess we look at ourselves that we're not product designers. We don't design something that will carry on forever. We're very reactive to what is available, and then it's gone, and we've moved on to something else completely. So I think you've got to be careful. That's why I guess we're looking more towards the kind of the symbiosis, and more regenerative landscape practices. That waste is not. You don't want to legitimize the waste. I think it's a tricky thing, but we view it as a material, that we can access, but we don't want to give the steel industry some kind of like greenwashing alibi because we're using their wastes, and they go, we're sustainable. So it's got to be sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe just to sort of lastly, I think it's really important for us to think about the relationship that people have with landscape as well, to try to sort of help people to have a better relationship with the landscape and things that we do. So in terms of like making things more legible, making people, if somebody lives in a home, that they can see that their house has been made from the landscape, and that sort of material speaks to them about where it's come from, and they feel much more engaged and connected with that place, as well as perhaps through the production of that place as well.
Yeah, brilliant, amazing. I want to be respectful of your time. We weren't able to get through all the questions, but I hope that we can continue interaction and conversation in the future. And although we were welcoming you online, it would be a pleasure to have you here at some point in person.
Anytime.
Thank you again so much. It was really fantastic, and just learned an incredible amount. So inspiring. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us. It's been a pleasure.
Real pleasure. Great to meet you all. Thank you very much.